Welcome. Get comfortable. Close your eyes if you'd like, and let's drift back through time together to explore the story of the First World War. Don't worry about remembering everything. Just let the words wash over you as we journey through history. Our story begins on a warm summer morning in Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina. The date was June 28, 1914. It was a Sunday, and the streets were lined with people waiting to catch a glimpse of Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria and his wife, Sophie. They had arrived in an open-top car, part of a motorcade winding through the city. The Archduke was heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, next in line to rule one of Europe's great empires. But on this particular morning, fate had other plans. Among the crowd stood a 19-year-old student named Gavrilo Princip. He was a member of a Serbian nationalist group called the Black Hand, and he carried a pistol in his coat. Earlier that morning, another member of his group had thrown a grenade at the Archduke's car, but had bounced off and exploded beneath the vehicle behind them. The motorcade sped away, and it seemed the danger had passed. But then, by pure chance, the Archduke's driver took a wrong turn. The car stalled just a few feet from where Princip was standing. In that moment, history pivoted. Princip stepped forward and fired 2 shots. Both the Archduke and Sophie were killed. This assassination set in motion a chain of events that would engulf the entire world. You see, Europe in 1914 was bound together by a complex web of alliances, like a house of cards waiting for the slightest breath of wind. Austria-Hungary, angry and grief-stricken, blamed Serbia for the assassination and issued an ultimatum with demands so severe that Serbia could never fully accept them. When Serbia's response fell short, Austria-Hungary declared war on July 28, exactly 1 month after the assassination. But this was not just a dispute between two nations. Russia, bound by Slavic ties and treaty obligations, began mobilizing its massive army to defend Serbia. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary, watched Russia's mobilization with alarm. The German military had long operated under something called the Schlieffen Plan, a strategy that assumed Germany would eventually have to fight both Russia and France at the same time. The plan called for a lightning-fast defeat of France in the west before Russia could fully mobilize its slow-moving forces in the east. Speed was everything in this plan. And so, when Russia mobilized, Germany felt it had no choice but to act immediately. On August 1st, 1914, Germany declared war on Russia. 2 days later, on August 3rd, Germany declared war on France. The dominoes were falling faster now. To reach France quickly, German forces needed to move through Belgium, a small neutral country. When Belgium refused Germany's demand for passage, German troops invaded anyway on August 4th. This violation of Belgian neutrality brought Britain into the war that same day, bound by its own treaty obligations to protect Belgium. Within just 6 weeks of that sunny morning in Sarajevo, most of Europe was at war. What's remarkable is that many people on all sides believed it would be over quickly. Young men rushed to enlist, afraid the fighting would end before they could experience the glory they imagined. In Germany, they called it der Tag, the day, as if this war was something they'd been eagerly anticipating. In Britain, recruitment posters promised adventure, and men lined up outside recruitment offices by the thousands. The prevailing belief was that everyone would be home by Christmas. But there was something else happening that summer, something that would make this war different from any that had come before. You see, the Industrial Revolution had transformed not just factories and cities, but also the weapons of war. Machine guns, which had existed in earlier forms, were now perfected to fire hundreds of rounds per minute. Artillery had become more powerful and accurate than ever before in human history. Railways could transport millions of soldiers and endless supplies of ammunition to the front lines. And new inventions like poison gas, tanks, and aircraft would soon make their debut on the battlefield. The war that began in August 1914 would not be the quick, glorious affair that so many expected. Instead, it would become something unprecedented, something that would reshape the world and haunt the memories of an entire generation. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. For now, just know that as summer faded into autumn that year, millions of men were saying goodbye to their families, boarding trains, and marching toward a future none of them could truly imagine. Let that settle in your mind as we pause here, at the very beginning of our journey through the Great War, the war they would later call the First World War. Because unimaginably, there would be a second. As the armies mobilized that August, something unexpected happened along the Western Front. The German advance through Belgium and into France moved with terrifying speed at first, just as the Schlieffen Plan had envisioned. German forces swept through the Belgian countryside, and by early September, they were just 30 miles from Paris. The French government packed up and fled to Bordeaux. It seemed the war might indeed be over quickly, just not in the way the French had hoped. But then came the First Battle of the Marne, fought from September 6th to 12th, 1914. This battle would prove to be one of the most significant moments of the entire war. French and British forces, in a desperate counterattack, managed to halt the German advance. There's a fascinating detail about this battle that sounds almost too strange to be true. The French commander, General Gallieni, needed to rush thousands of reinforcements to the front line quickly. Paris's railway system couldn't move them fast enough, so he requisitioned every taxicab in Paris. More than 600 Parisian taxi drivers ferried about 6,000 soldiers to the battle. Imagine that scene. Ordinary taxicabs, the kind you'd hail on a street corner, racing through the night to deliver soldiers to one of history's pivotal battles.
The German advance was stopped at the Marne, and something profound happened next. Both sides tried to outflank each other, moving northward toward the English Channel in what became known as the Race to the Sea. Neither side could get around the other, and gradually, almost inevitably, the armies began to dig in. They dug trenches, at first just temporary shelters, but these trenches would become deeper, more elaborate, and more permanent with each passing week. By November 1914, the Western Front had solidified into a continuous line of trenches stretching more than 400 miles from the North Sea coast of Belgium all the way to the Swiss border. 400 miles of muddy ditches, barbed wire, and fortified positions. And here's what's truly sobering. This line would barely move more than 10 miles in either direction for the next 3.5 years. Millions of men would fight and die over strips of land you could walk across in minutes. Life in these trenches was unlike anything soldiers had experienced before. The trenches weren't simple ditches, but elaborate systems with front-line trenches, support trenches, and reserve trenches, all connected by communication trenches. A soldier might spend several days in the front line, then rotate back to support positions, then to reserve, then to rest areas behind the lines, before the cycle began again. But even in the front-line trenches, combat wasn't constant. In fact, soldiers often spent far more time waiting, enduring, and simply surviving conditions than actually fighting. The mud was perhaps the most universal misery. When it rained, which it did often in Flanders and northern France, the trenches became rivers of thick, clinging mud that could swallow a man. Soldiers stood in this cold water and mud for hours, sometimes days. This led to a condition called trench foot, with a constant cold and what would cause feet to swell, turn numb, and in severe cases, developed gangrene. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers suffered from trench foot during the war. The only prevention was to try to keep feet dry and change socks regularly. But in a waterlogged trench under enemy fire, this was often impossible. And then there were the rats. The rats in the trenches grew fat and bold, feeding on food scraps and, more grimly, on the bodies of the dead that often lay in no man's land between the opposing trenches, unreachable for burial. Soldiers reported rats as big as cats. They would crawl over sleeping men at night, steal food from packs, and their presence was simply another part of the constant, wearing misery of trench life. Yet amid all this horror, something remarkable happened during the first Christmas of the war. In December 1914, along various parts of the Western Front, an unofficial truce spontaneously broke out. It began on Christmas Eve, when German soldiers started placing candles on their trench parapets and singing Christmas carols. British soldiers, hearing the familiar melodies across no man's land, began singing back. In some places, soldiers from both sides climbed out of their trenches, met in the middle, and shook hands. They exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons from uniforms as souvenirs. In several locations, they even played football together, using whatever they could find for a ball. For a few brief hours or days, depending on the location, the war simply stopped. Men who had been trying to kill each other days before shared photographs of their families and talked about their hopes of going home. The Christmas truce of 1914 was never officially sanctioned, and many officers disapproved of it. When the high commands heard what happened, they issued strict orders that such fraternization must never occur again. And it didn't, not on the same scale. As the war dragged on and the casualties mounted, the bitterness grew too deep. But for that one Christmas, in the first year of the war, humanity briefly pierced through the darkness. It's a reminder that even in the worst circumstances, there remained ordinary men who longed for peace, who remembered what it meant to see the person across from him as human. As 1914 drew to a close, the reality was settling in on all sides. This would not be a short war. The trenches were now a fact of life, stretching across the landscape like scars. And as winter descended on the Western Front, soldiers on both sides huddled in their muddy ditches, wondering how long this could possibly continue. The year 1915 brought new horrors to the battlefield, and with it, a weapon that would come to symbolize the ruthlessness of modern warfare. On April 22, 1915, near the Belgian town of Ypres, German forces released chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders along a 4-mile front. A yellow-green cloud drifted across no man's land toward the Allied trenches, carried by the wind. The soldiers who saw it coming had no idea what it was. When the gas reached them, men began choking, their lungs burning, gasping for air that wouldn't come. This was the first large-scale use of poison gas in the war, and it caused panic. Entire units broke and fled, creating a gap in the Allied lines. The Germans advanced, but, fortunately for the Allies, didn't have enough reserves ready to fully exploit the breakthrough. They had been testing this new weapon and hadn't expected it to work quite so well. The use of poison gas opened a dark new chapter. Both sides would go on to develop and deploy various types of gas throughout the war. Chlorine, phosgene, and a particularly feared mustard gas, which caused painful blistering of the skin and lungs. By the war's end, more than 1 million soldiers had been casualties of chemical weapons, though many survived with permanent damage. The response to gas warfare was the development of gas masks, and soldiers learned to carry them at all times. There's something deeply unsettling about the photograph from this era. Rows of soldiers with insect-like gas masks, looking more alien than human, a visual representation of how the war had transformed everything it touched. But let's step back from the Western Front for a moment and look at the wider world, because this war was becoming truly global. In the Middle East, the Ottoman Empire had joined the Central Powers in October 1914, and this opened up entirely new theaters of war. One of the most disastrous campaigns took place at Gallipoli, a peninsula in modern-day Turkey. The plan, championed by Winston Churchill, who was then First Lord of the Admiralty, was to knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war by seizing the Gallipoli Peninsula, opening a route to Constantinople, and establishing a supply line to Russia through the Black Sea. On paper, it seemed achievable. The campaign began on April 25, 1915, with Allied landings at several beaches on the peninsula. British, French, Australian, and New Zealand troops came ashore, expecting to advance quickly inland. Instead, they found Ottoman forces well prepared and positioned on the high ground above the beaches. The Allied soldiers were pinned down, unable to advance beyond the beaches and the narrow coastal strips. What was meant to be a quick campaign turned into another grinding stalemate, much like the Western Front, but with the added misery of the Mediterranean heat, lack of fresh water, and swarms of flies that fed on the dead and the living alike. The Anzacs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps, fought with particular distinction at Gallipoli, and their landing on April 25th became a defining moment in both nations' histories. Anzac Day is still commemorated every year in Australia and New Zealand as their most significant national remembrance. But the cost was staggering. The campaign dragged on for 8 months before the Allies finally evacuated in January 1916, having achieved nothing. The total casualties on both sides exceeded 500,000 men, with over 130,000 dead. For the Allies, Gallipoli was a catastrophic failure, and it would end Churchill's position in the government, at least temporarily. While men fought and died at Gallipoli, something significant was happening back in Britain. The war was consuming resources at an unprecedented rate. Factories needed to produce millions of shells, bullets, uniforms, and all the other materials of modern warfare. But so many men had enlisted that there was a labor shortage. The solution was revolutionary for its time. Women entered the workforce in enormous numbers, taking jobs that had previously been reserved exclusively for men. They worked in munitions factories, becoming known as munitionettes or canary girls, the latter nickname coming from the yellow tint their skin would take on from exposure to TNT. They drove buses and trams, worked as postal workers, served as nurses near the front lines, and took on countless other roles. More than 1 million women worked in munitions factories alone during the war. The work was dangerous. Accidents were common, and the chemicals they handled were toxic. In 1917, an explosion at a munitions factory in Silvertown, London, killed 73 people and injured hundreds more. But the women persisted, and their contribution was undeniable. This massive shift in women's roles would have lasting effects. The traditional arguments against women's suffrage, that women were too delicate for public life or couldn't contribute to the nation in the same way as men, became much harder to maintain when women were quite literally building the weapons that kept the army supplied. In 1918, British women over the age of 30 who met certain property qualifications won the right to vote, a recognition, in part, of their service during the war. Back on the Western Front, as 1915 wore on, the generals searched desperately for a way to break the stalemate. The answer they arrived at was simple, brutal, and tragically flawed. More men, more shells, more attacks. This thinking led to massive offensives like the Battle of Loos in September 1915, where British forces launched an attack that gained little ground at the cost of tens of thousands of casualties. The pattern was becoming grimly familiar. Artillery would bombard enemy trenches for hours or even days, attempting to destroy the barbed wire and kill the defenders. Then, at a predetermined time, soldiers would climb out of their trenches and walk across no man's land toward the enemy. But the artillery rarely destroyed all the machine gun positions, and the wire was often barely cut. The defenders, having endured the bombardment in deep dugouts, would emerge and open fire on the advancing troops. The losses were becoming almost incomprehensible. In a single day during a major battle, casualties could number in the tens of thousands. Entire battalions would be virtually wiped out in hours. Small villages back in Britain would lose nearly all their young men in a single afternoon, all of them serving together in what were called PALS battalions, units recruited from the same town or workplace. The idea had seemed wonderful at first. Men could serve alongside their friends and neighbors. But when a PALS battalion was destroyed, as many were, it meant that an entire community's youth vanished together. As 1915 ended, the war had been raging for 16 months. The quick victory everyone had predicted was now a distant, almost laughable memory. The trenches remained, the casualties mounted, and still no one could see a way forward. But the nations were committed now, too deep in blood and treasure to simply stop. And so the war would continue into 1916, into what will become some of the most devastating battles in human history. The year 1916 will be defined by two battles, both of which have become synonymous with the futility and horror of the First World War. The first began on February 21st, 1916, when German forces launched a massive offensive against the French fortress city of Verdun. The German Chief of Staff, Erich von Falkenhayn, had chosen Verdun deliberately. It was a place of deep symbolic importance to France, a fortress city that had held against invaders for centuries. Falkenhayn believed the French would defend Verdun at any cost, and his strategy was grimly simple: to bleed France white. He would use Verdun as a killing ground, where German artillery would methodically destroy French forces faster than they could be replaced. The Battle of Verdun would last for 10 months, making it the longest single battle of the war. The German artillery bombardment that began the battle was like nothing ever witnessed before. In just the first day, more than 1 million shells fell on the French positions. The landscape around Verdun was transformed into something resembling the surface of the moon, a wasteland of overlapping craters, shattered trees, and churned earth. Villages that stood for centuries were erased so completely that after the war, they were never rebuilt. To this day, there are areas around Verdun called the Zone Rouge, the Red Zone, where the soil remains so saturated with unexploded ordnance and poison that it's too dangerous for human habitation. The French commander, General Philippe Pétain, organized a supply line that became known as La Voie Sacrée, the Sacred Way. This was a single road over which an endless stream of trucks carried men, ammunition, and supplies to the front. One truck passed every 14 seconds, day and night, for months. Nearly every soldier in the French army rotated through Verdun at some point during the battle. They came to call it the Mill on the Meuse, because it ground men up as relentlessly as a millstone grinds grain. When the Battle of Verdun finally ended in December 1916, the front line had barely moved. The Germans had advanced a few miles at most, and even those gains were largely reversed by French counterattacks. The cost was almost beyond comprehension. Approximately 300,000 men killed and another 400,000 wounded, split roughly evenly between French and German forces. 700,000 casualties to move a line on a map a few miles, only to end up nearly where it started. But while Verdun raged, the British were planning their own massive offensive. The Battle of the Somme was meant to be the decisive blow that would break the German lines and end the war. It began on July 1st, 1916, and that single day will become the bloodiest day in British military history. After a week-long artillery bombardment that fired 1.7 million shells, British commanders were confident the German defenses had been destroyed. At 7:30 in the morning, whistles blew along the British line, and tens of thousands of soldiers climbed out of their trenches and began walking toward the German positions. The artillery bombardment had not destroyed the German defenses. The Germans had built deep dugouts, some more than 30 feet underground, where they sheltered during the bombardment. When it stopped, they emerged, set up the machine guns, and opened fire. The British soldiers, laden with up to 60 pounds of equipment, walked in neat lines across no man's land. Just as they had been trained to do, they were cut down in waves. By the end of that first day, the British Army had suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, with almost 20,000 dead. It remains the worst single day of casualties in British military history, and the battle continued for 4.5 more months. The Somme offensive finally ended in November 1916, when autumn rains turned the battlefield into an impassable swamp. The British and French had advanced roughly 6 miles at the deepest point of their penetration. The total casualties on all sides exceeded 1 million men. 1 million casualties for 6 miles of devastated ground. Among those who fought at the Somme was a young writer named J.R.R. Tolkien, who would later describe how the desolate landscape of the Somme influenced his depiction of Mordor in The Lord of the Rings. While these massive battles consumed the attention of the Western Front, something revolutionary was slowly developing that would change warfare forever. On September 15, 1916, during the Battle of the Somme, the British deployed a new weapon for the first time, the tank. These early tanks were slow, unreliable, and prone to breaking down. They could barely manage for miles per hour, and many got stuck in shell craters or broke down from mechanical failures. Of the 49 tanks committed to that first attack, only 21 made it to the German lines. But those that did caused shock and confusion among the German defenders, who had never seen anything like these steel monsters crawling across the battlefield, impervious to machine gun fire. The British had developed the tank in secret, and to maintain secrecy during its construction, they told workers the machines were water tanks destined for use in Mesopotamia. The name tank stuck. These first tanks were ungainly and primitive, but they represented a solution to the central problem of trench warfare: how to cross no man's land while protected from machine gun fire. Over time, tanks would become faster, more reliable, and more heavily armed. By 1918, they would play a crucial role in breaking the stalemate. As 1916 drew to a close, the war had consumed 2 full years. The battles of Verdun and the Somme alone had killed or wounded more than 1.5 million men. And still, the trench lines remained largely unchanged. The generals promised that victory was near, that one more push would do it, but the soldiers in the trenches knew better. They had seen too much, lost too many friends, endured too much suffering. The optimism of 1914 was gone, replaced by a grim determination to simply survive. While the armies clashed on land, another crucial battle was taking place beneath the waves of the Atlantic Ocean. Germany had declared the waters around the British Isles a war zone, and German submarines, called U-boats, were hunting Allied merchant ships. Britain was an island nation that depended on imports for survival: food, fuel, raw materials for its factories. If Germany could cut these supply lines, Britain would be starved into submission without ever losing a battle on land. This submarine campaign would come to be known as unrestricted submarine warfare, meaning U-boats would sink merchant ships without warning, even neutral vessels heading to Allied ports. The most infamous incident of the U-boat campaign occurred on May 7, 1915, when a German submarine torpedoed the British ocean liner Lusitania off the coast of Ireland. The great ship sank in just 18 minutes, and of the nearly 2,000 people aboard, 1,198 died. Among the dead were 128 Americans. The sinking caused international outrage, particularly in the United States, which was still neutral at this point. Germany argued that the Lusitania had been carrying munitions, which was technically true, but the death of so many civilians shocked the world. The incident pushed American public opinion toward the Allies, though the United States would not enter the war for nearly 2 more years. By 1917, Germany was becoming desperate. The British naval blockade of German ports was slowly strangling the German economy and causing severe food shortages among the civilian population. The winter of 1916 to 1917 became known in Germany as the turnip winter because turnips, normally used as animal fodder, became a staple of the human diet when other foods ran short. Hundreds of thousands of German civilians would die from malnutrition-related diseases during the war. In this desperate situation, German military leaders convinced Kaiser Wilhelm II to resume unrestricted submarine warfare in February 1917. Despite knowing it would likely bring America into the war, they gambled that they could starve Britain into submission before American forces could arrive in significant numbers. This gamble would prove to be one of the great miscalculations of the war. President Woodrow Wilson, who had campaigned for re-election in 1916 on the slogan, "He kept us out of war," could no longer maintain American neutrality in the face of German submarines sinking American ships. But there was another factor that pushed America toward war, and it involved one of the most remarkable documents in the history of espionage, the Zimmermann telegram. In January 1917, German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann sent an encrypted telegram to the German ambassador in Mexico. In this message, Zimmermann proposed that if the United States entered the war, Mexico should ally with Germany. In return, Germany would help Mexico recover the territories it had lost to the United States in the 19th century: Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. The telegram was intercepted and decoded by British intelligence. The British waited for the perfect moment, then shared it with the American government. When the telegram was published in American newspapers in March 1917, public outrage exploded. The idea that Germany was scheming to give American territory to Mexico was intolerable to most Americans. On April 6, 1917, the United States declared war on Germany. America's entry would eventually prove decisive, but it would take time. The United States had a small professional army, only about 200,000 men, and would need to draft and train millions more. American soldiers wouldn't arrive in France in large numbers until 1918. But psychologically, America's entry was immediately significant. It gave the Allies a tremendous boost of morale and convinced them they could win a war of attrition, because America's industrial capacity and manpower were virtually unlimited. The spring of 1917 brought crisis for the Allies on another front as well. In Russia, years of military disasters and severe hardship on the home front had created a revolutionary situation. Tsar Nicholas II, who had ruled the vast Russian Empire, was forced to abdicate in March 1917. A provisional government took power, promising to continue the war against Germany. But Russia was exhausted, its army shattered by years of defeats, its economy in ruins, and its people starving. In November 1917, the Bolsheviks, led by Vladimir Lenin, seize power in a second revolution. Lenin had promised peace, land, and bread, and he was determined to take Russia out of the war. In March 1918, Russia signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk with Germany, formally ending its participation in the war. The terms were harsh. Russia lost vast territories, including Poland, Ukraine, Finland, and the Baltic states. But for Germany, this was a tremendous strategic victory. For more than 3 years, Germany had been fighting a two-front war, dividing its forces between East and West. Now, with Russia out of the war, Germany could transfer hundreds of thousands of troops from the Eastern Front to the West for one final, desperate offensive. Back on the Western Front in 1917, the year had seen more costly offensives that achieved little. The French army, exhausted by redundant years of fruitless attacks, experienced widespread mutinies in the spring of 1917. Entire divisions refused orders to attack, though they said they would continue to defend their positions. The mutinies were suppressed, with some soldiers executed as examples, but the French army's offensive capability was severely compromised. General Pétain, now commander-in-chief of the French forces, had to promise that there would be no more large offensives until American forces arrived and conditions were more favorable. The burden of the fighting in the West fell increasingly on the British, who launched their own devastating offensive at Passchendaele in Belgium. The battle lasted from July to November 1917 and gained about 5 miles at a cost of roughly 300,000 British casualties, many of whom drowned in the liquid mud that the battlefield had become. As 1917 ended and 1918 began, the war stood at a crucial turning point. Russia was out, but America was in. Germany had one last chance to win the war before overwhelming American strength could tip the balance. Everything would be decided in the coming year. On March 21st, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the first phase of what became known as the Spring Offensive, or Kaiserschlacht, the Kaiser's Battle. This was Germany's last great gamble, an all-or-nothing attempt to break through the Allied lines and win the war before American forces arrived in overwhelming numbers. The offensive began with an artillery bombardment of unprecedented scale. More than 10,000 German guns opened fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front, firing over 1 million shells in just 5 hours. It was the heaviest artillery concentration the world had ever seen. The German strategy was different this time. Instead of the methodical, prolonged bombardments that had warned defenders of coming attacks, this barrage was short, intense, and followed immediately by specially trained assault troops called Sturmtruppen or stormtroopers. These soldiers used new infiltration tactics. Rather than advancing in waves across no man's land, they moved in small groups, bypassing strong points and pushing deep into Allied positions to create chaos and confusion. For the first time in years, the war became mobile again. The Germans advanced up to 40 miles in some sectors, the deepest penetration of Allied lines since 1914. For a few weeks in the spring of 1918, it seemed Germany might actually win. Paris was within range of German artillery, and shells began falling on the city from a remarkable weapon, the Paris gun, a massive artillery piece that could fire shells over 70 miles. Parisians could hear the explosions, but couldn't hear the guns firing, creating an eerie sense of being bombarded from nowhere. The psychological impact was significant, though the military effect was minimal. But Germany's spring offensive, despite its initial successes, was ultimately doomed. The advances had created deep salients, bulges in the line that were difficult to supply and defend. German soldiers, many of whom had been surviving on meager rations for months, were stunned when they overran British supply depots and found them full of food, wine, and equipment. Some German units simply stopped advancing to loot and eat, breaking the momentum of the attack. More fundamentally, Germany had thrown everything into this offensive and lacked the reserves to exploit its gains. By June 1918, the offensive had stalled, having cost Germany nearly 1 million casualties it could not replace. Meanwhile, American troops were arriving in France at a rate of 250,000 per month. These fresh soldiers, full of energy and optimism, stood in stark contrast to the exhausted armies that had been fighting for 4 years. The Americans suffered from inexperience and initially took heavy casualties as they learned the harsh lessons of modern warfare, but their numbers were overwhelming. By the summer of 1918, there were over 1 million American soldiers in France, and more arriving every week. The tide was turning. On August 8, 1918, the Allies launched a massive counteroffensive near Amiens in France. British, Canadian, Australian, and French forces, supported by hundreds of tanks and aircraft, smashed through German lines. The German General Ludendorff would later call August 8 the Black Day of the German Army. It wasn't just a military defeat that shook him, but the reports that German soldiers were surrendering en masse, and that retreating German troops were being called strike breakers by those who had given up hope. The will to fight was breaking. Throughout September and October 1918, the Allies continued to attack all along the Western Front in what became known as the 100 Days Offensive. The Germans fought stubbornly but were being pushed back steadily. The carefully constructed trench systems that had held for years were finally being broken through. Behind the front lines, Germany was collapsing. The British naval blockade had created near-starvation conditions. The economy was in ruins. And in early November, revolution broke out. Sailors in the German Navy mutinied, rather than sail on a suicidal last mission against the British fleet. The mutiny spread, and within days, uprisings occurred across Germany. Kaiser Wilhelm II, who had ruled Germany since 1888, abdicated on November 9th and fled to neutral Holland, where he would live in exile until his death in 1941. With the Kaiser gone and revolution sweeping the country, Germany's new government had no choice but to seek peace. In a railway carriage in the forest of Compiègne in northern France, German representatives met with Allied commanders. At 5 a.m. on November 11, 1918, they signed the Armistice Agreement. The fighting would cease at 11 a.m. that same day, the 11th hour, the 11th day of the 11th month. Along the Western Front, as 11 o'clock approached, artillery continued to fire, and men continued to die right up until the final minute. Some sources suggest nearly 3,000 casualties occurred on the last day of the war, including men who died just minutes before the ceasefire took effect. And then, at precisely 11 o'clock, the guns fell silent. After more than 4 years, the war was over. The silence was said to be deafening. Men who had lived with the constant roar of artillery for years suddenly heard birds singing. Some soldiers cheered. Others simply sat in stunned silence, unable to quite believe it was truly finished. In cities across the Allied nations, people poured into the streets in celebration. Church bells rang, strangers embraced, and tears of joy mixed with tears of grief for all those who hadn't lived to see this day. But the joy was tempered by exhaustion and the knowledge of what had been lost. The world that existed before August 1914 was gone forever, and no one yet knew what world would replace it. The armistice of November 11th was just a ceasefire, not a peace treaty. The actual terms of peace would be negotiated at a conference that opened in Paris on January 18, 1919. Representatives from 32 nations gathered at the Palace of Versailles, but the real decisions were made by the Big Four. Woodrow Wilson of the United States, David Lloyd George of Britain, George Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. Germany was not invited to participate in the negotiations. The defeated Central Powers would simply be presented with the treaty terms and told to sign. The negotiations were difficult and sometimes bitter. Each of the Allied leaders had different goals. President Wilson arrived in Paris with his 14 points, a vision for a just and lasting peace that included the creation of a League of Nations, an international organization designed to prevent future wars through collective security and diplomacy. Clemenceau, the French premier nicknamed the Tiger, wanted something very different. France had been invaded twice by Germany in living memory, in 1870 and again in 1914. French territory had been the primary battlefield of the Western Front. Clemenceau wanted Germany crushed, permanently weakened, so it could never threaten France again. He famously quipped about Wilson's idealism. God gave us the 10 Commandments and we broke them. Wilson gives us the 14 points. We shall see. The Treaty of Versailles was finally signed on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand. The treaty was harsh, particularly in its treatment of Germany. Article 231, which became known as the War Guilt Clause, declared that Germany and its allies were responsible for causing the war and all the loss and damage that resulted. This clause was used to justify the enormous reparations that Germany was required to pay to the Allied nations. The exact amount wasn't determined until 1921, when it was set at 132 billion gold marks, equivalent to roughly $33 billion at the time, an almost incomprehensible sum. But the financial burden was only part of it. Germany lost substantial territory. Alsace-Lorraine, which Germany had taken from France in 1871, was returned to France. Germany lost all its overseas colonies, which were divided among the Allied powers. The Polish Corridor was created, giving the newly independent Poland access to the sea, but cutting off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. The industrial Saar region was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years, with its coal production going to France. Germany's military was severely restricted. The army was limited to just 100,000 men, tanks and aircraft were forbidden, and the navy was reduced to a token force. The Rhineland, the region of Germany bordering France, was to be permanently demilitarized. Many observers at the time worried that the treaty was too harsh, that it would create lasting resentment in Germany without actually preventing Germany from eventually recovering its strength. John Maynard Keynes, a British economist who had attended the Paris Peace Conference, wrote a prophetic book called The Economic Consequences of Peace, in which he argued that the treaty's terms were economically impossible to fulfill and would lead to instability and possibly another war. He resigned from his position in protest. As history would show, these warnings were tragically prescient. The human cost of the war was staggering beyond imagination. Approximately 10 million soldiers had been killed. France alone lost 1.4 million men, roughly 1 out of every 5 Frenchmen between the ages of 20 and 45. Britain lost nearly 900,000, Germany over 2 million, Russia roughly 1.8 million, and Austria-Hungary around 1.2 million. The United States, which entered late, still lost over 116,000 men. But these numbers don't capture the millions more who were wounded, many with injuries that left them permanently disabled. Some estimates suggest that for every man killed, 3 more were wounded. Millions of veterans returned home missing limbs, blinded, or suffering from what was then called shell shock, what we would now recognize as post-traumatic stress disorder. The civilian death toll was enormous as well, though exact numbers are difficult to determine. The Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 to 1919, which may have killed up to 50 million people worldwide, is often linked to the war. The massive movement of troops and the weakened condition of populations after years of war created perfect conditions for the virus to spread globally. Many historians believe the disease actually originated in the United States and was carried to Europe by American troops, but it became known as the Spanish flu because Spain, being neutral in the war, had no wartime censorship and reported on the disease freely, while belligerent nations tried to suppress news of the epidemic to maintain morale. Beyond those who died from disease, millions of civilians had starved or died from exposure. The Ottoman Empire's genocide of the Armenian people, which occurred during the war years of 1915 to 1916, killed an estimated 1.5 million Armenians. It was one of the first modern genocides, a deliberate attempt to eliminate an entire people, and it occurred in the chaos and cover provided by the wider war. The war had also redrawn the map of the world. For great empires that had existed for centuries collapsed. The German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the Russian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire. From their ruins emerged new nations: Poland, Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Finland, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and eventually Turkey as a new republic. The Middle East was carved up by Britain and France, creating new states like Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon, with borders drawn by colonial powers with little regard for ethnic or religious divisions. These artificial borders would create conflicts that continue to this day. As the soldiers came home and tried to rebuild their lives, they found a world forever changed. The certainties of the pre-war era were gone. The faith in progress, in the inherent rationality of European civilization, had been shattered in the mud of Flanders and the carnage of the Somme. A generation of poets, writers, and artists who had survived the war tried to make sense of what they had experienced. Their works, filled with disillusionment and a sense of profound loss, captured the mood of the post-war world. They spoke of a lost generation, young people whose lives had been irreparably damaged by the war, who could never quite fit back into civilian society after what they had witnessed. One of the most enduring legacies of the First World War is how we remember it. In the years immediately after the war, memorials began appearing in nearly every town and village that had sent men to fight. In Britain alone, more than 100,000 war memorials were erected, each one inscribed with the names of local men who had not returned. The cenotaph in London, designed by Sir Edwin Lutyens and unveiled in 1920, became the focal point for national remembrance. The word cenotaph comes from Greek, meaning empty tomb, a memorial to those whose bodies were never recovered or identified. And there were so many unidentified dead. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had simply vanished, their bodies obliterated by artillery fire or lost in mud, leaving their families without even a grave to visit. This led to creation of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier, a concept that was adopted by many nations. In Britain, an unidentified body was brought back from France and buried in Westminster Abbey on November 11, 1920, exactly 2 years after the armistice. France interred its unknown soldier beneath the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. The United States placed its unknown soldier in Arlington National Cemetery in 1921. These tombs became powerful symbols, representing all those who had died and allowing families without graves to have a place to mourn. The war had also brought about significant social changes that would reshape the 20th century. The role of women had been fundamentally altered. Women who had worked in factories, driven ambulances, and served as nurses during the war were not willing to simply return to their pre-war status. In Britain, women over 30 gained the right to vote in 1918, and in 1928, this was extended to all women over 21. In the United States, the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, was ratified in 1920. Similar movements succeeded in many other countries in the years following the war. The war had also accelerated technological change in ways that would shape the modern world. Aviation, which had been in its infancy before the war, advanced dramatically. In 1914, aircraft were fragile, slow machines used primarily for reconnaissance. By 1918, there were specialized fighter planes engaging in aerial combat, bombers capable of striking targets behind enemy lines, and the beginnings of strategic air power theory. Many of the pilots who pioneered military aviation would go on to establish commercial airlines in the 1920s, using surplus military aircraft. The war had proven that the airplane was more than a novelty. It was the future of transportation and warfare. Medical advances during the war also had lasting impacts. The The desperate need to treat massive numbers of casualties led to innovations in surgery, particularly in the treatment of traumatic injuries. Blood transfusion techniques were refined and became more widely used. The use of X-rays became standard practice for locating bullets and shrapnel in wounded bodies. Perhaps most significantly, the war drove improvements in prosthetics and reconstructive surgery, as doctors worked to help hundreds of thousands of men who had lost limbs or suffered severe facial injuries. The pioneering work of surgeons like Harold Gillies, who performed some of the first modern plastic surgery operations on soldiers with facial wounds, laid the foundation for modern reconstructive surgery. The war's impact on literature and art was profound. A whole generation of writers and poets had experienced the trenches firsthand, and they transformed how war was depicted in literature. Poets like Wilfred Owen and Siegfried Sassoon wrote with brutal honesty about the reality of modern warfare, stripping away the romantic notions of glory and honor that had characterized earlier war poetry. Owen's most famous poem, Dulce et decorum estate, takes its title from a Latin phrase meaning, "It is sweet and fitting to die for one's country," but the poem itself is a savage rejection of that sentiment, describing in graphic detail a gas attack and its aftermath. Owen himself was killed just 1 week before the armistice on November 4th, 1918. His mother received a telegram informing her of his death on November 11th, as the church bells were ringing to celebrate the end of the war. The psychological impact of the war lingered for decades. Shell shock, now recognized as a form of PTSD, affected hundreds of thousands of veterans. Many struggle with nightmares, flashbacks, and an inability to adjust to civilian life. Some spent years in hospitals, unable to speak or function. The understanding and treatment of psychological trauma was primitive in the 1920s, and many veterans received little help. Some estimates suggest that as many as 80,000 British veterans were still receiving treatment for shell shock a decade after the war ended. The invisible wounds of war proved just as debilitating as the physical ones, and it would take many more decades before society fully understood the psychological cost of combat. As the 1920s progressed, the world tried to move forward, to rebuild and forget. But the war's shadow was too long, its impact too deep. The economic instability caused by the war and the harsh terms of the peace treaties created conditions for future conflicts. The bitterness felt in Germany over the Treaty of Versailles, the economic chaos of the 1920s and early 1930s, and the failure of the League of Nations to prevent aggression all set the stage for an even more devastating conflict. Many historians now view the First World War and the Second World War not as separate events, but as a single, terrible conflict with a 20-year pause between them. The First World War had been called the war to end all wars, a phrase that captured the hope that something so terrible could never be allowed to happen again. But it was not to be. The world that emerged from the trenches of 1918 was fragile, wounded, and carrying the seeds of future tragedy. Yet from that darkness also came determination, a determination to remember, to honor those who had suffered and died, and to work toward a world where such a catastrophe could never happen again. Every November 11th, at the 11th hour, many nations still pause for a moment of silence, remembering not just the end of that terrible war, but all those who have fallen in conflict since. Let us turn now to some of the smaller stories, the human details that sometimes get lost in the vast sweep of history. There were animals in this war too, millions of them, and their stories are worth remembering. Horses were used extensively throughout the war, despite the introduction of motorized vehicles. It's estimated that more than 8 million horses died during the conflict, serving as cavalry mounts, pulling artillery and supply wagons, and carrying wounded men from the battlefield. In the muddy conditions of the Western Front, horses could sometimes go where motor vehicles could not, but they suffered terribly from the same artillery fire, gas attacks, and diseases that afflicted the soldiers. Dogs also played a crucial role in the war. They served as messengers, carrying vital communications between units when telephone lines were cut by artillery fire. Some dogs were trained to find wounded soldiers in no man's land, carrying medical supplies and packs on their backs. One famous dog, a terrier named Stubby, became the most decorated war dog of World War I. Stubby served with American forces for 18 months and participated in 17 battles. He learned to warn his unit of incoming artillery shells and gas attacks, and he once captured a German soldier by holding him by his trousers until American soldiers arrived. After the war, Stubby met 3 presidents and became a celebrity. His story a small bright spot in an otherwise dark time. Pigeons, surprisingly, were among the most reliable means of communication during the war. Radio technology was still primitive, and telephone lines were constantly being destroyed by artillery. Pigeons could fly through the worst conditions, carrying messages in small capsules attached to their legs. One pigeon named Cher Ami became legendary when, despite being shot to the breast and losing an eye and a leg, she delivered a message that saved 194 American soldiers who were trapped behind enemy lines in October 1918. The message read simply, "We are along the road parallel to 276.4. Our own artillery is dropping a barrage directly on us. For heaven's sake, stop it." Cher Ami flew 25 miles in just 25 minutes to deliver that message, and the artillery barrage was stopped. She survived her injuries and was awarded the French Croix de Guerre for her service. The war also saw the birth of the modern concept of the ace fighter pilot. An ace was a pilot who had shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft. These men became celebrities. Their exploits followed eagerly by the public back home, who were hungry for heroes in a war that offered few clear victories. The most famous of all was Germany's Manfred von Richthofen, known as the Red Baron, because of the bright red color he painted his aircraft. Richthofen was credited with 80 confirmed aerial victories, more than any other pilot in the war. He was a skilled and disciplined pilot, a natural leader who commanded a squadron of elite German fighter pilots known as a Flying Circus because of their brightly painted aircraft. The Red Baron was killed in action on April 21st, 1918, shot down over the Somme. He was just 25 years old. His death was mourned even by his enemies, who buried him with full military honors. The war introduced the world to a new kind of horror, chemical weapons used on a massive scale. By the war's end, dozens of different chemical agents had been deployed. While chlorine and phosgene were used early in the war, it was mustard gas, first used by Germany in 1917, that became the most feared. Mustard gas was different from earlier gases because it was persistent, meaning it could contaminate an area for days or even weeks. It caused severe blistering of the skin, temporary blindness, and terrible damage to the lungs. What made it particularly insidious was that its effects weren't immediate. Soldiers exposed to it might not realize they'd been gassed until hours later, by which time the damage was done. By the end of the war, chemical weapons had caused over 1.3 million casualties, though the majority survived, often with lifelong health problems. The final year of the war saw the emergence of the Spanish flu pandemic, which we mentioned earlier, but its connection to the war deserves more attention. The close quarters in which soldiers lived, the massive movements of troops from continent to continent, and the weakened physical condition of both soldiers and civilians created ideal conditions for the virus to spread and mutate into more deadly forms. Some historians have argued that the flu may have played a role in ending the war, as it struck Germany particularly hard in the summer of 1918, weakening the effectiveness of the final German offensives. The pandemic killed more people than the war itself, a sobering reminder that disease can be more deadly than bullets and shells. After the war, the process of recovery was long and painful. The physical landscape of the Western Front had been so thoroughly devastated that some areas took decades to return to productive use. In France and Belgium, Farmers plowing their fields even today still regularly uncover unexploded shells, grenades, and other ordnance from the war. The iron harvest, as it's called, yields up hundreds of tons of rusted weaponry every year, more than a century after the fighting ended. Some areas remain too contaminated with unexploded ordnance and chemical weapons to ever be safely inhabited. They stand as permanent scars on the landscape, silent testimony to the war's fury. The war's economic impact was equally profound and long-lasting. Britain, which had been the world's leading financial power before the war, emerged deeply in debt, having borrowed heavily from the United States to finance the war effort. The United States, conversely, emerged as the world's leading creditor nation in economic power, a position it has largely maintained ever since. The war had accelerated the shift of global economic power from Europe to America, a shift that would reshape international relations for the rest of the 20th century. The economic chaos that followed the war, the hyperinflation in Germany in the early 1920s, where people carried wheelbarrows full of nearly worthless currency to buy basic goods, the global depression of the 1930s, all could be traced back in part to the economic disruptions caused by the First World War. As we reflect on these facts and stories, what emerges is a picture of a war that touched every aspect of human life, that changed not just political boundaries but the very fabric of society. It was a war that killed millions, traumatized a generation, and set in motion forces that would shape the rest of the 20th century. Let's explore some final stories and facts that help complete the picture of this transformative conflict. The war touched lives in ways both large and small, creating ripples that extended far beyond the battlefields. One of the war's most enduring symbols is the red poppy, which have become the international symbol of remembrance for those who died in war. This tradition began with a poem written by Canadian physician Lieutenant Colonel John McCrae, who served as a medical officer in Belgium. In May 1915, after presiding over the funeral of a friend who had been killed in battle, McCrae noticed how red poppies had begun to grow in the disturbed earth of the graves in Flanders. That image inspired him to write In Flanders Fields, one of the most famous poems of the war. The poem begins with the lines, In Flanders fields the poppies blow slash between the crosses, row on row. McCrae himself would not survive the war. He died of pneumonia in January 1918, just months before the armistice. But his poem lived on, and the poppy became a symbol of remembrance, worn on lapels every November 11th in many countries. The youngest known soldier to die in World War I was a British boy named John Condon, who was only 14 years old when he was killed in May 1915. John had lied about his age to enlist, as did hundreds of thousands of other underage boys throughout the war. The minimum age for military service was supposed to be 19 for overseas deployment, but recruiting officers, desperate to fill quotas, often looked the other way when boys clearly younger than that claimed to be of age. It's estimated that as many as 250,000 underage British boys served in the war, many of them just 15 or 16 years old. These children faced the same horrors as adult soldiers, and thousands of them never came home. The war also saw remarkable acts of medical heroism and innovation. One Australian surgeon, Captain Neville House, became the first member of the Australian Army Medical Corps to receive the Victoria Cross, Britain's highest military honor. He earned it in 1915 for running into open ground under heavy fire to rescue a wounded soldier. But beyond individual acts of bravery, the war drove systematic improvements in military medicine. The concept of triage, prioritizing treatment based on severity of injuries and likelihood of survival, was refined during this war. Ambulance services became more organized and efficient, with motorized ambulances replacing slower horse-drawn versions. cutting the time it took to get wounded men from the front lines to field hospitals. One unexpected consequence of the war was its impact on timekeeping. Before World War I, wristwatches were considered feminine accessories. Men carried pocket watches. But in the trenches, fumbling with a pocket watch while trying to coordinate an attack or artillery barrage was impractical and dangerous. Officers began wearing their pocket watches on leather straps around their wrists, and gradually purpose-made wristwatches became standard military equipment. Soldiers returning home after the war continued to wear wristwatches, and within a few years, they had become the norm for men as well as women. The war had literally changed how we tell time. The scale of ammunition expenditure during the war is almost incomprehensible. Britain alone fired over 170 million artillery shells during the 4 years of fighting. To put that in perspective, that's more than one shell for every person living in Britain, France, and Germany combined at the time. During the Battle of Verdun, an average of 100,000 shells fell on the battlefield every single day for 10 months. The industrial capacity needed to produce this quantity of ammunition transformed entire economies. Factories that had made consumer goods were converted to munitions production, and new factories were built at a frantic pace. The war gave rise to new forms of propaganda and information control. Governments on all sides created elaborate propaganda machines to maintain public support for the war and to demonize the enemy. Posters became a primary medium. With iconic images like the British "Your country needs you" poster featuring Lord Kitchener pointing at the viewer, or the American "I want you for U.S. Army" poster with Uncle Sam in a similar pose. Newspapers were heavily censored, and casualty reports were often delayed or sanitized to prevent public morale from collapsing. This was the first war where public opinion was systematically manipulated on a mass scale, setting precedents that governments would follow in future conflicts. Another lasting legacy of the war was the advancement of women into professional roles previously closed to them. During the war, women not only worked in factories, but also served in more professional capacities. In Britain, the Women's Army Auxiliary Corps was established in 1917, employing women in non-combat roles such as clerks, cooks, and drivers, freeing up men for frontline service. By the war's end, over 80,000 women had served in various auxiliary military services. Similarly, nursing became professionalized during the war, with organizations like the Voluntary Aid Detachment training thousands of women to serve as nurses near the front lines. These women often worked in horrific conditions, dealing with wounds and suffering that would have been unimaginable before the war, and their service helped break down barriers to women's participation in professional life. The war's influence on language and culture was profound. Many phrases and words that we use today originated in or were popularized by World War I. Terms like no man's land, over the top, 0 hour, and shell shock all entered common usage during the war. The experience of the trenches created a shared vocabulary among those who served, a language that helped them communicate experiences that civilians could never fully understand. This linguistic legacy remains with us. Words and phrases that carry echoes of that long-ago conflict embedded in our everyday speech. Finally, as we come to the end of our journey, it's worth reflecting on how the First World War changed humanity's relationship with war itself. Before 1914, war was often romanticized, seen as an opportunity for glory and honor. The poets and artists of previous generations had celebrated martial valor and noble sacrifice, but the First World War shattered these illusions. The industrial-scale slaughter, the senseless waste of young lives for minimal gains, the suffering of an entire generation, all of this made war seem not glorious but obscene. The literature, art, and film that came out of World War I reflected this transformation, depicting war as tragedy rather than triumph. This shift in consciousness, this understanding that modern war was something to be avoided rather than celebrated, became one of the war's most important legacies, even if it wasn't enough to prevent future conflicts. Let us continue our journey a little longer, moving deeper into the details of this war that changed everything. In the early months of the war, before the trenches solidified, there was a race to control the English Channel ports. If Germany could capture these ports, particularly Calais and Dunkirk, they could threaten Britain's supply lines and potentially launch an invasion across the narrow strait. In October and November 1914, a series of desperate battles took place around the Belgian city of Ypres, known as the First Battle of Ypres. British and French forces, heavily outnumbered, managed to hold the line against German attacks. One particularly crucial moment came when the British deployed their highly trained professional army, the Old Contemptibles, as they became known, a nickname they wore with pride. These were the regulars, career soldiers who could fire 15 aimed rifle shots per minute, a rate so rapid that German forces sometimes believed they were facing machine guns rather than rifles. By the end of the First Battle of Ypres, the British Expeditionary Force had been virtually destroyed, with casualties reaching nearly 90% in some units, but the Channel ports remained in Allied hands. The war at sea took many forms beyond the submarine campaign we discussed earlier. The largest naval battle of the war occurred on May 31st and June 1st, 1916, off the coast of Denmark. This was the Battle of Jutland, where the British Royal Navy's Grand Fleet met the German Imperial Navy's High Seas Fleet in the only major fleet engagement of the war. More than 250 ships participated in the battle, and the fighting was intense. The British lost more ships and men than the Germans, 14 ships and over 6,000 sailors killed, compared to Germany's 11 ships and about 2,500 men. But strategically, the battle was a British victory. The German fleet retreated to port and never again seriously challenged British naval supremacy. For the rest of the war, the German High Seas Fleet remained largely confined to harbor, while the British maintained their crucial blockade. One aspect of the war that often goes unmentioned is the role of colonial troops. The European powers drew heavily on their colonial empires to fill their ranks. France recruited hundreds of thousands of soldiers from its North and West African colonies, including Algeria, Morocco, Senegal, and Madagascar. Britain enlisted over 1 million Indian soldiers, along with troops from Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and various African colonies. These colonial soldiers served in every theater of the war, from the trenches of France to the deserts of Mesopotamia. They suffered the same hardships and died in the same mud as European soldiers, yet their contributions are often overlooked in popular memory of the war. Over 1.5 million Indian soldiers served in the British forces during World War I, and more than 74,000 of them died. The War Memorial at India Gate in New Delhi bears the names of more than 13,000 Indian soldiers who died in the war. The war also spread to Africa, where Germany's colonies became battlegrounds. In German East Africa, modern-day Tanzania, a German commander named Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck led a brilliant guerrilla campaign that tied down far larger Allied forces for the entire duration of the war. With a force that never exceeded about 15,000 men, most of them local African soldiers called Askaris, von Lettow-Vorbeck conducted raids and ambushes that forced the British to commit over 300,000 troops to the East African theater. He remained undefeated in the field and only surrendered 2 weeks after the armistice in Europe, when he finally received word that Germany had lost the war. His campaign is considered one of history's most successful guerrilla operations. The Middle Eastern theater of the war saw its own dramatic campaigns. British forces, aided by Arab forces in revolt against Ottoman rule, fought to control Palestine and Mesopotamia. The Arab Revolt, which began in 1916, was partly organized by a British officer named T. Lawrence, who became famous as Lawrence of Arabia. Lawrence worked to unite various Arab tribes against their Ottoman rulers, promising them independence after the war. He led Arab irregular forces in daring raids against Ottoman supply lines, most famously helping to capture the port city of Aqaba in July 1917. However, the promises made to the Arabs would largely be broken after the war, when Britain and France divided the Middle East between them according to the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement, creating lasting bitterness and conflicts that echo to this day. The war witnessed what many historians consider the first strategic bombing campaign. German Zeppelins' massive rigid airships filled with hydrogen began bombing raids on British cities as early as January 1915. London was bombed multiple times, and the raids caused panic among civilians who had never before experienced attack from the air. The Zeppelins would arrive at night, their engines barely audible, dropping bombs seemingly at random on the darkened city below. Initially, Britain had no effective defense against these high-altitude raiders. But gradually, new fighter aircraft and incendiary ammunition were developed specifically to combat the Zeppelin threat. When a Zeppelin was hit by incendiary rounds, the hydrogen inside would ignite, turning the massive airship into a fireball that would plummet to Earth. By 1917, the Zeppelin threat had been largely neutralized, though Germany continued to bomb Britain using large multi-engine aircraft called Gothas. In total, German air raids on Britain killed about 1,400 civilians and injured over 3,000 more during the war. The Italian front, which opened when Italy entered the war on the Allied side in May 1915, became another grinding stalemate similar to the Western Front, but fought in the mountains. Italy and Austria-Hungary fought a series of 12 battles along the Isonzo River between 1915 and 1917, each one achieving little at tremendous cost. The fighting took place at high altitude in the Alps, where soldiers had to contend not just with enemy fire, but with extreme cold, avalanches, and the difficulty of moving supplies up steep mountain paths. More soldiers died from exposure and avalanches than from enemy action in some sectors. The worst single day of the Italian front came during the Battle of Caporetto in October 1917, when a combined German and Austro-Hungarian force, using new infiltration tactics, broke through Italian lines and sent the Italian army into a catastrophic retreat. Italy lost over 300,000 men in this single battle, most of them taken prisoner, and came close to collapse before stabilizing a new defensive line. The psychological stress of combat in World War I created not just shell shock, but other, stranger phenomena. Soldiers reported experiencing hallucinations, visions of angels on the battlefield, and stories of supernatural intervention. The most famous of these was the Angels of Mons, a legend that spread among British troops in 1914, claiming that angels, or ghostly archers from the medieval Battle of Agincourt, had appeared to protect retreating British soldiers during the Battle of Mons. Though likely a combination of exhaustion, stress, and wishful thinking, these stories reveal how soldiers cope with the incomprehensible reality of modern industrial warfare, searching for meaning or divine protection in a conflict that seemed to have neither. Let these additional stories wash over you now, adding depth and texture to your understanding of this vast conflict. The First World War was not one story, but millions, each soldier, each civilian, each victim experiencing their own personal war within a larger catastrophe. As we continue our exploration of the Great War, let us look at some of the human experiences and remarkable details that illuminate the character of this conflict. The war was fought not just with weapons, but with ingenuity, endurance, and sometimes unexpected compassion. Communication between the front lines and headquarters was one of the constant challenges of trench warfare. Beyond pigeons and runners, armies developed elaborate systems of underground telephone cables, burying them deep to protect them from artillery fire. At the height of the war, the British Army alone had laid over 7,000 miles of telephone cable on the Western Front. Soldiers trained as linesmen had the dangerous job of going out during and after bombardments to find and repair breaks in the cables, often working in no man's land under fire. These forgotten heroes kept the vital flow of information moving, allowing commanders to coordinate the complex movements of modern warfare. The trenches themselves became remarkably complex structures over time. What began as simple ditches evolved into elaborate underground cities. Some German dugouts were excavated 30 feet or more below ground, complete with electric lighting, ventilation systems, furniture, and even wallpaper in officers' quarters. The chalk soil of the Somme region was particularly suitable for deep excavation. These dugouts provided protection during artillery bombardments that could last days or even weeks. Soldiers would huddle underground, feeling the earth shake with each explosion above, waiting for the bombardment to end so they could emerge and man their defensive positions. One of the war's most audacious tactics involved mining. Engineers would dig tunnels from their own trenches toward enemy lines, sometimes extending hundreds of feet, then packed into the tunnel with explosives. The goal was to detonate these mines directly beneath enemy trenches, creating massive craters and destroying defensive positions. The largest of these was a detonation of 19 mines beneath German positions at Messines Ridge in Belgium on June 7, 1917. The explosions, which used over 450 tons of explosives, were so massive they were reportedly heard in London, 140 miles away. The blast killed an estimated 10,000 German soldiers instantly and was said to be the loudest man-made sound in history up to that point. The ground shook like an earthquake, and the psychological impact on survivors was devastating. Not all the mines planted during the war were detonated. Several tunnel systems were abandoned or their locations lost when the war ended. One mine containing 22 tons of explosives was discovered and safely detonated in 1955 near Ypres, creating a crater 120 feet across. Even today, there are at least 4 known unexploded mine chambers still buried beneath the fields of Flanders, containing tons of aging explosives that are too dangerous to excavate or detonate. They remain there, silent and deadly, monuments to a war that still hasn't entirely released its grip on the land. The war produced many unlikely heroes, including animals we haven't yet mentioned. Canaries were taken into the tunnels and mines, serving as early warning systems for poisonous gases, just as they would later be used in coal mines. When a canary showed signs of distress or died, soldiers knew to evacuate immediately. Cats and terriers were kept in trenches to hunt rats, providing both practical pest control and companionship for soldiers far from home. There are photographs of soldiers cradling kittens or puppies they'd adopted as mascots, moment of tenderness amid the brutality. The Christmas truce of 1914 that we discussed earlier was not the only instance of unofficial cooperation between enemies. Throughout the war, there were periods of live and let live in quieter sectors of the front, where both sides tacitly agreed to avoid unnecessary violence. Soldiers would establish routines, firing at the same times and places each day so that the other side knew when to take cover. Some units would deliberately aim high during their required firing exercises. This informal cooperation was an attempt by ordinary soldiers to make an impossible situation slightly more bearable, though officers on both sides tried to suppress it, fearing it would undermine fighting spirit. Food in the trenches varied greatly depending on nationality and supply situation. British soldiers received regular rations that typically included canned meat, often referred to disparagingly as bully beef, hard biscuits, tea, and jam. The monotony was soul-crushing, and soldiers treasured packages from home containing treats like chocolate, cigarettes, or tinned goods. French soldiers received wine as part of their rations, usually about a quarter liter per day, which they called pinard. German soldiers' rations grew increasingly meager as the British blockade took effect, with bread being stretched with sawdust and potato flour by 1917. Hunger became a constant companion for German troops in the final years of the war, sapping their strength and morale. Letters home were the lifeline connecting soldiers to the world they'd left behind. Both sides censored mail, with officers reading soldiers' letters to ensure no sensitive military information was disclosed. Soldiers developed coded ways to communicate their true conditions despite censorship, or simply wrote cheerful lies to spare their families worry. The volume of mail was staggering. The British Postal Service alone delivered around 2 billion letters to and from the front during the war, an average of about 12 million letters per week. These letters, thousands of which survive in archives and family collections today, provide intimate glimpses into the thoughts and feelings of men living through unimaginable circumstances, worrying about loved ones at home, describing the small details of daily life in the trenches, and trying to maintain hope that they would someday return. The psychological need for normalcy led to the creation of trench newspapers, crude publications written and illustrated by soldiers, often featuring dark humor, poetry, and satirical articles about military life. These papers, with names like the Wipers Times, Wipers being soldier slang for Ypres, or the Listening Post, were remarkable for their spirit and creativity. They mocked the high command, made jokes about their terrible circumstances, and kept spirits up through laughter. One famous cartoon from the Wipers Times showed two soldiers standing in a flooded trench, with the caption, "What did you do in the Great War, Daddy?" "I tried to keep my feet dry, my son." These publications show how humor, even gallows humor, became a survival mechanism. Rest now with these images. Soldiers writing letters by candlelight in a dugout, the careful rituals that help men stay sane, the small acts of kindness and defiance against the war's dehumanizing machinery. The Great War was vast beyond comprehension, yet it was also made up of countless small human moments. As we approach the end of our journey to the First World War, let us gather a few final threads. Some last stories that help us understand the full scope and legacy of this conflict that changed the world forever. The final months of the war saw innovations that would shape the future of warfare. In August 1918, the Battle of Amiens demonstrated what became known as combined arms tactics, coordinating infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft in a unified assault. Over 400 tanks were deployed alongside infantry, supported by coordinated airstrikes and a precisely timed artillery barrage. This battle marked the beginning of modern mechanized warfare, where different branches of military worked together in carefully orchestrated operations. It was a far cry from the crude frontal assaults of 1914, showing how much military thinking had evolved under the pressure of necessity. One remarkable technological development was the use of sound ranging to locate enemy artillery. Teams of microphones would be positioned along the front line to detect the sound of enemy guns firing. By precisely measuring the time differences between when each microphone detected the sound, mathematicians could triangulate the position of the enemy battery, often with accuracy within a few yards. This technology allowed counter-battery fire to silence enemy guns before they could do significant damage, and it represented an early application of what would later become sonar and radar technology. The war also saw the first extensive use of aircraft carriers. While ships capable of launching aircraft had existed before the war, HMS Furious, converted in 1917, became one of the first true aircraft carriers with a flight deck that allowed planes to both take off and land. On July 19, 1918, aircraft from HMS Furious conducted the first carrier-based air strike in history, attacking German Zeppelin sheds at Tundern. Though the raid's success was limited, it demonstrated a concept that would revolutionize naval warfare in the decades to come. The influenza pandemic that swept the world in 1918 and 1919 had a curious pattern. Unlike most flu viruses that primarily killed the very young and very old, the Spanish flu killed healthy adults in their prime. Many historians believe this was because the virus triggered a cytokine storm, an overreaction of the immune system, meaning that young people with strong immune systems were actually more vulnerable. The timing was particularly cruel, with many soldiers surviving 4 years of war only to die of flu in the final months or just after returning home. The pandemic killed more people in 1 year than the Black Death killed in 4 years during the Middle Ages. After the armistice, the process of bringing millions of soldiers home was a massive logistical challenge. Demobilization of the Allied armies took months. Many soldiers spent Christmas 1918 still in France or Belgium, waiting for transport home. Some remained as occupation forces in Germany. The psychological transition from soldier to civilian was often difficult. Men who had spent years in the military, living under orders and in constant danger, found peacetime life strange and sometimes meaningless. Many struggled to talk about their experiences with people who hadn't been there, leading to feelings of isolation and alienation. The cost of the war was not just measured in lives, but in money that would burden nations for generations. The total cost of the war has been estimated at over $200 billion in contemporary dollars, though the true economic cost, including lost productivity and the destruction of infrastructure, was far higher. Britain's national debt increased by over 1,000% during the war. France had to rebuild vast areas of its northern territory that had been completely destroyed. Germany's economy was crushed not just by the direct cost of the war, but by the reparations demanded by the Treaty of Versailles, leading to hyperinflation that destroyed the savings of millions of ordinary Germans. The war left behind a landscape of memorials and cemeteries that stretch across Europe. The Commonwealth War Graves Commission maintains over 2,500 war cemeteries in more than 150 countries, containing the graves of over 1.7 million Commonwealth servicemen and women. Each headstone is uniform, a symbol that in death all are equal, whether they were generals or privates. The Thiepval Memorial on the Somme bears the names of over 72,000 British and South African soldiers who died in the Somme battles and whose bodies were never found or identified. Walking through these cemeteries today, seeing row upon row of white headstones stretching into the distance, the scale of the loss becomes tangible in a way that numbers alone cannot convey. Perhaps one of the most poignant aspects of the war's legacy is how it affected art and literature for generations. The works of the war poets like Wilfred Owen, Siegfried Sassoon, and Rupert Brooke captured the transformation from patriotic enthusiasm to bitter disillusionment. Their poetry remains some of the most powerful anti-war literature ever written. In the decades after the war, novelists like Eric Maria Remarque with All Quiet on the Western Front and Robert Graves with Goodbye to All That wrote memoirs and novels that try to convey the reality of the trenches to those who hadn't experienced them. These works shaped how subsequent generations understood the war, cementing its image as a futile catastrophe, a warning about the dangers of nationalism, militarism, and the failure of diplomacy. And so we come now, truly, to the end of our journey through the First World War. We have traveled from that fateful morning in Sarajevo in June 1914 through 4 years of unprecedented warfare, to the armistice in November 1918 and beyond into the war's long aftermath. We have explored the great battles and the small human moments, the technological innovations and the terrible costs, the front lines and the home fronts, the famous figures and the forgotten millions. The First World War was called a Great War by those who lived through it, not because there was anything great or good about it, but because of its magnitude, its scope, its impact on human civilization. It swept away the old world of empires and aristocracy, ushered in new technologies and new ways of killing, changed the role of women in society, redrew the map of the world, and left scars on nations and families that would take generations to heal, if they ever fully did. But amid all the darkness, there were also moments of humanity. The Christmas truce, the letters written home, the care of medics of the wounded, the loyalty of friends in the trenches, the small acts of compassion between enemies. These moments remind us that even in the worst circumstances, human kindness and dignity can survive. As you drift towards sleep now, let these 100 more facts settle gently in your mind. Remember that history is not just dates and battles, but millions of individual human stories, each one valuable, each one worth remembering. The soldiers of the First World War on all sides were not so different from us. They loved their families. They had hopes and dreams. They endured suffering that we can barely imagine, and many of them never came home. We remember them, and in remembering, we honor their sacrifice and perhaps learn something about the preciousness of peace, the tragedy of war, and the resilience of the human spirit. May their memory be a blessing. May their sacrifice not be forgotten, and may we continue to strive for a world where such a catastrophe never happens again. Now, rest well,